After 10 years of spotless reviews, late nights, and promises that I was next in line, my promotion disappeared overnight. Then HR quietly closed the door and asked me one question that made me reconsider my resignation. 10 years at Calder & Pierce had taught me that offices had their own weather. Monday mornings carried the cold pressure of unread emails and calendar alerts. Friday afternoons loosened into quiet laughter near the elevators. But that Tuesday morning felt different. The executive floor was almost unnaturally still, sunlight reflecting off the glass conference rooms while I sat across from my boss, Daniel Mercer, watching him avoid my eyes. Between us lay a closed folder containing the decision I had spent 3 years working toward: Director of Operations. I had already been doing half the job without the title, stepping into broken projects, training new managers, handling furious clients, and answering messages long after everyone else had gone home. My performance reviews had been consistently excellent. 6 months earlier, Daniel had called me the obvious internal candidate. Now he folded his hands and said, "We've decided to go in a different direction." For a moment, I honestly thought there had been some misunderstanding. I had completed 4 interviews for the director position, including a 90-minute panel where 2 executives asked me how I would restructure the department. HR had requested examples of projects I had rescued, leadership evaluations, and a detailed 90-day plan. I had given them everything. "Was there an issue with my interviews?" I asked. Daniel shook his head too quickly. "No, your interviews were strong." "My performance? Excellent. Experience? More than enough. Client feedback? Outstanding." Then came the phrase corporate managers seem to keep behind glass for emergencies. "We're looking for a different kind of leadership potential." I almost admired its efficiency, 5 words that sounded important while explaining absolutely nothing. I asked what kind. Daniel looked toward the window. "Someone who can bring a fresh perspective." That was when disappointment stopped feeling like disappointment and started feeling like a warning. I returned to my desk without making a scene. Around me, the department moved normally, keyboards clicking, printers humming, someone laughing beside the coffee machine. My inbox still contained congratulations from coworkers who had assumed the promotion was practically settled. One message from a regional manager read, "When you're officially director, please remember the rest of us." I stared at it longer than I should have. 10 years of service suddenly felt less like a foundation and more like a receipt nobody intended to honor. Still, I wasn't angry enough to be careless. I opened a private folder and began saving copies of my performance reviews, interview invitations, written feedback, and the emails where Daniel had discussed preparing me for the director role. I didn't know what I was looking for yet. I only knew his explanation didn't match the paper trail. The answer arrived before lunch. Melissa from finance stopped beside my desk carrying a folder against her chest. She normally spoke with the confidence of someone who could make an expense report feel personally ashamed. But now she lowered her voice. "You heard about the director position?" I nodded. She hesitated. "Do you know Evan Rourke?" I didn't. "You will," she said, then walked away when Daniel appeared at the far end of the corridor. 20 minutes later, an internal announcement landed in my inbox. "Please welcome Evan Rourke as our new Director of Operations." I opened the attached biography and read it twice. Evan was 29. He had joined the company 9 months earlier in a strategy role 2 levels below mine. His previous management experience consisted of supervising a small project team for less than a year. Then I saw the last name again, Rourke. Our senior vice president was Charles Rourke. I searched the company directory, hoping coincidence would rescue the situation. Instead, an old internal newsletter appeared in the results. There was Charles at a charity event, smiling beside a younger man whose face I recognized from Evan's profile. The caption identified him plainly: Charles Rourke and his nephew, Evan. I leaned back in my chair as the office noise seemed to fade around me. Suddenly, fresh perspective had a family tree. The 4 interviews, the case study, the leadership presentation, all those carefully scheduled conversations. Had any of them mattered? I remembered one strange moment from my final interview, when an executive had barely looked at my presentation and spent most of the meeting checking his phone. At the time, I had blamed myself for failing to hold his attention. Now, that memory had acquired sharper edges. I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't send an angry email or march into HR demanding justice. Instead, I checked dates. Evan had been added to several director-level meetings 3 weeks before my final interview. One calendar invitation had originally been forwarded to me by mistake before being recalled. I still had the notification. Then I found an email from Daniel asking me to prepare transition documentation for future leadership continuity, nearly a month before the supposed hiring process ended. Individually, each detail could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that was becoming difficult to ignore. At 6:17 that evening, after most of the floor had emptied and the windows had turned into dark mirrors, I wrote my resignation notice. It was short, professional, and almost painfully polite. I thanked the company for 10 years of opportunities and gave appropriate notice. No accusations, no mention of Evan, no emotional farewell. I scheduled a meeting with Daniel for the next morning and closed my laptop. I thought walking away quietly was the only dignity I had left. I had no idea that one question from HR would make that resignation the most important document I almost submitted. I came in the next morning with my resignation letter folded inside a plain envelope. Daniel was already at his desk when I placed it in front of him. He looked at my name on the envelope, then at me. "You're resigning?" I nodded. There wasn't much left to explain. I had spent 10 years proving I could handle more responsibility, only to watch the director position go to someone with 9 months at the company. Daniel started telling me not to make a decision while I was disappointed, but then, almost in the same breath, asked if I could use my notice period to train Evan. Apparently, the man chosen over me needed me to teach him the job I supposedly wasn't right for. That became obvious an hour later, when Evan appeared at my desk with a notebook and a list of questions. He was polite, even slightly embarrassed, but he didn't understand several of the reports the director reviewed every week. He mixed up 2 major client accounts and had never handled one of our quarterly vendor reviews. I answered without making it personal. Evan wasn't the person who had designed the hiring process. Then, while asking about an executive meeting, he casually said, "Uncle Charles told me you know this department better than anyone." I looked up. Evan immediately corrected himself. "Charles, sorry, I call him Charles here." Senior VP Charles Rourke, his uncle. I already knew they were related, but hearing Evan say it so naturally made the whole situation feel even more absurd. I asked one simple question. "When did Charles first mention the director position to you?" Evan hesitated. "A few weeks ago, maybe longer." Before I could ask anything else, an HR notification appeared on my screen. Rachel Kim, our HR director, wanted to see me immediately. I expected an exit interview. Instead, Rachel was sitting in a small conference room with someone from compliance. My resignation letter was on the table between them. Rachel skipped the usual pleasantries. "Is this resignation because you didn't receive the Director of Operations position?" "Yes." She asked me to describe the hiring process. 4 interviews, a leadership assessment, a 90-day plan, strong feedback, years of excellent performance reviews. Then the sudden decision that the company wanted someone with different leadership potential. I told her I later discovered the successful candidate was Charles Rourke's 29-year-old nephew. The compliance officer began taking notes. Rachel asked, "Were you informed about that relationship during the process?" "No." "Were you told Charles had any involvement in the selection?" "No." She exchanged a glance with the compliance officer. It lasted perhaps a second, but it changed the temperature of the room. Then Rachel asked the question I wasn't expecting. "Do you know who got the job?" "Evan Rourke." She shook her head slightly. "I mean, do you know when he got it?" I said nothing. Rachel explained that HR had found inconsistencies in the hiring records. Some internal communications suggested Evan may have been treated as the selected candidate before my final interview had even taken place. Interview dates didn't line up cleanly with approval records. Certain scores had raised questions. Compliance was beginning an internal review. Suddenly, I remembered the strange details I had saved the night before. Daniel's email about preparing materials for future leadership continuity, the recalled director-level calendar invitation, the messages encouraging me to complete another interview even though Evan had apparently already been entering executive meetings. The compliance officer asked whether I still had those emails. Yes. Preserve everything. Rachel pushed my resignation letter toward me. "It hasn't been processed yet. You can still withdraw it." I stared at the page. Less than a day earlier, leaving had felt like the only decision that preserved my dignity. But now I understood that resigning would also remove me from the building, just as compliance started asking questions. I took a pen and wrote "withdrawn" across the letter. I'm staying. When I returned to my floor, Daniel was waiting near my desk. "Everything okay?" "Just HR paperwork." His smile arrived a little too late. That afternoon, an internal notice appeared. The Director of Operations transition was temporarily frozen pending review. Evan remained at the company, but several changes connected to his promotion were paused. 2 members of the interview panel were called into separate meetings. Charles canceled the rest of his afternoon schedule. At 4:42, Rachel sent me one short message. "Please preserve all correspondence related to your candidacy." I opened the folder on my computer. Interview records, performance reviews, emails, calendar notices. 10 years of work had created something favoritism hadn't accounted for. A paper trail. And now compliance wanted to read it. If you were in my position, would you have withdrawn the resignation or walked away anyway? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe if you want to see where this investigation leads. By Thursday morning, the office had developed the particular silence that appears when everyone knows something is happening, but nobody knows how much they are allowed to know. Charles Rourke's door stayed closed. Evan was still technically Director of Operations, but the promotion freeze had left him in an awkward corporate limbo. The title existed, while much of the authority behind it did not. I kept working. No gossip, no accusations, no victory lap. Rachel's warning had been clear, and I had no intention of giving anyone a reason to turn the investigation into a discussion about my behavior. At 10:15, compliance called me upstairs again. This time there were 3 people in the room: Rachel, the compliance officer I had met before, and a corporate attorney named Martin Hale. A thick folder sat in front of him. Martin began with dates. When had Daniel first encouraged me to apply? When was my first interview? When did I submit my 90-day plan? Had anyone suggested the position was already promised to someone else? I answered carefully, and only when I was certain. Then they asked about the email I had mentioned. I forwarded the original message from Daniel. It had been sent almost 4 weeks before the final hiring decision. He had asked me to prepare updated operating procedures and client transition notes for future leadership continuity. At the time, I assumed he was preparing the department for whoever won the position. Martin read it silently. Did Daniel explain who future leadership referred to? No. Next came the recalled calendar invitation. I still had the automated notification showing that Evan had briefly been added to a meeting reserved for directors and senior leadership before my final interview. Compliance already had the meeting records. That was when the questions changed. They were no longer asking whether something had happened. They were trying to determine who knew about it. Martin showed me my interview evaluation. 3 panel members had given me strong scores. One evaluation described me as immediately ready for director-level responsibility. Another specifically mentioned my 10 years of institutional knowledge and leadership during 2 major client crises. Then he turned a page. Evan's scoring sheet contained something strange. One evaluator had submitted a score before Evan's official final interview date. I stared at the date. Is that possible? Martin asked. Not if these dates are accurate, Rachel folded her hands. That's one of the issues under review. There was more. HR records showed that Charles had recommended Evan for expanded system access before the selection process officially ended. An internal email referred to Evan's upcoming transition, while other candidates, including me, were still interviewing. No single document contained a dramatic confession. Nobody had written, "Give my nephew the job." Corporate favoritism was apparently more sophisticated than that. But the timeline was beginning to speak for itself. I left the meeting almost an hour later and found Daniel waiting near the elevators. Can we talk? We stepped into an empty conference room. He closed the door but remained standing. I don't know what you've been telling compliance, he said. Then you should probably ask compliance. His jaw tightened. I'm trying to protect the department. So am I. Daniel walked toward the window. These situations get complicated. Decisions are made above our level. It was the first honest thing he had said to me all week. I asked one question. When did you know Evan was getting the position? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. After several seconds, Daniel said, You should be careful about assuming you understand how executive decisions are made. I looked at him. I'm not assuming anything. That's why I'm answering their questions. The conversation ended there. That afternoon, the internal review expanded. 2 more people from HR were assigned to collect interview records, and compliance requested archived emails connected to the director selection. Charles didn't appear at the weekly leadership meeting. Evan spent most of the day behind a closed door. Then, shortly before 5, Rachel called me. The review has been escalated, she said. To what? A formal investigation. I waited. She continued carefully. The Compliance Committee has requested the complete hiring file, including communications involving executive leadership. The director promotion will remain frozen until that review is complete. I thanked her and hung up. Outside the windows, evening had settled over the city, turning the glass buildings across the street into strips of gold and shadow. My desk looked exactly as it always had. Coffee mug, reports, 2 pens, a stack of vendor documents. Nothing dramatic had changed. And yet 3 days earlier, I had been ready to carry everything in that desk home in a cardboard box. Now my resignation was canceled, the promotion was frozen, and a formal investigation was moving upward through the company. I hadn't threatened anyone. I hadn't demanded revenge. I had simply kept the emails. The formal investigation changed the office faster than any announcement could have. By Monday, nobody was casually dropping in to Charles Rourke's office anymore. His assistant had cleared most of his calendar, and 2 members of the compliance committee had arrived from headquarters. They didn't look dramatic. No security guards, no raised voices, no executives being marched through the lobby. Just quiet people carrying laptops into conference rooms and requesting records. Somehow, that was more unsettling. Corporate investigations didn't need thunder. Sometimes they arrived as calendar invitations. I was interviewed again that afternoon. This time, they barely asked about my disappointment over the promotion. They wanted facts, dates, conversations, documents. I walked them through my performance reviews and the emails Daniel had sent during the months before the director position opened. One message described me as his strongest succession candidate. Another said my experience made me uniquely prepared to lead the department. 3 months later, after Charles became involved in the selection process, Daniel's language had changed. Suddenly, I needed more executive presence, then more leadership range, then, finally, a fresh perspective. The committee had noticed the same shift. They also had documents I had never seen. According to the interview records, the company was supposed to use a standardized scoring process for every candidate. Yet Evan's file contained additional recommendations from senior leadership that weren't included in the normal process. Charles had also participated in conversations about the position without formally declaring the family relationship in the conflict of interest documentation. Then came the detail that made Martin Hale stop turning pages. An archived email showed Charles discussing Evan's transition into the director role 11 days before my final interview. Nobody in the room reacted dramatically. Martin simply wrote something down. But that date changed everything. My interview hadn't merely been unsuccessful. There was now evidence suggesting that at least one senior executive had been discussing the successful candidate as though the decision had already been made while the official hiring process was still continuing. "What happens now?" I asked. Martin closed the folder. "That's for the committee to determine." So I went back downstairs and did my job. Evan approached me near the elevators late that afternoon. He looked exhausted. "I didn't know they were still seriously considering other people," he said. I studied him for a moment. "What did you think the interviews were for?" He glanced toward the hallway before answering. "Charles told me HR required the process." That sentence landed quietly. Required for what? Evan realized too late what he had said. "I shouldn't be discussing this." He walked away. I didn't follow him. I didn't need to. I wrote down the time and exact wording while it was fresh, then sent Rachel a short message saying I had information potentially relevant to the review. The next morning, compliance interviewed Evan again. By noon, Charles had been temporarily removed from involvement in hiring and promotion decisions pending the investigation. Daniel was called upstairs shortly afterward and didn't return for almost 3 hours. When he finally came back, He looked 10 years older. He stopped at my desk. "You documented everything, didn't you?" There was no accusation in his voice anymore, just realization. "I kept my records." Daniel nodded slowly. For years, I had assumed professionalism meant absorbing disappointments gracefully and moving forward. Now I understood another side of it. Professionalism also meant keeping accurate records when promises changed, decisions stopped making sense, and powerful people expected everyone beneath them to forget what had been said. By Friday, the director promotion was no longer merely frozen. HR formally suspended the appointment while the compliance committee completed its findings. Evan returned to his previous position temporarily. Charles remained senior VP, but his authority over staffing decisions was restricted. Then Rachel called me upstairs one more time. She looked tired, but for the first time since this began, there was something different in her expression. "The committee has completed its initial findings," she said. "They identified significant hiring irregularities and an undisclosed conflict of interest. The matter is being referred to the board." "The board?" "Yes." I sat back. What had begun as one denied promotion had traveled from Daniel's office to HR, from HR to compliance, and now from compliance to the people who could examine executive conduct itself. Rachel continued, "Your candidacy records will also be reviewed independently. I can't promise you an outcome." "I understand." "And one more thing." She placed a document on the table. It was the original Director of Operations posting. Across the top was a new status: Selection void. Position to be reopened pending board review. I stared at it for several seconds. I hadn't taken Evan's promotion away. I hadn't asked anyone to punish Charles. I hadn't leaked emails, embarrassed anyone publicly, or tried to settle the score. Their own records had done that. And now the decision that was supposed to end my future at the company had been officially erased. The board review ended less dramatically than I expected. Rachel called me upstairs and gave me the result in a few clear sentences. The director selection had been compromised by an undisclosed conflict of interest. Charles had participated in decisions involving his nephew. Evan had been treated as the preferred candidate before the interviews were finished, and the promotion was officially void. Charles lost his authority over hiring and promotions. Daniel received formal disciplinary action for failing to report what he knew. Evan returned to his previous position. There were no public confrontations or dramatic exits, just decisions recorded in documents and quietly enforced. Then Rachel told me the director position would reopen under an independent panel. "You're welcome to apply again." I hesitated. After everything that had happened, I didn't want the company giving me the position simply to repair its reputation. "If I get it," I said, "I want to earn it." That's exactly why we're starting over. So I interviewed again. This time, there were no strange questions about fresh perspective or mysterious changes behind closed doors. The panel challenged my operational plan, questioned my budget priorities, and asked how I would handle several problems the department was already facing. It was difficult, direct, and fair. 3 days later, Rachel called. The panel made its decision. I waited. "You were the unanimous choice for Director of Operations." For a moment, I just looked through the window at the office where I had spent 10 years building my career. 2 weeks earlier, I had been ready to leave it carrying a resignation letter. Now I was staying on my own terms. I accepted. The company later strengthened its conflict of interest rules and required greater oversight for senior promotions. I didn't ask for anyone to be humiliated, and I never needed revenge. The investigation had done what anger couldn't. It forced the company to look at its own records. 10 years of service never guaranteed me a promotion, but they deserved a fair chance. And once the process became fair, I didn't need favoritism to win.